"Enjoy, rancher. She bites," the Apache trader said, but he did buy her to save himself. John Harper had lived all his life among the towering peaks and dense forests of the mountains. From the moment he could walk, he had been surrounded by the wildness of nature, sharp rocks underfoot, the sound of rushing streams, and the scent of pine trees thick in the air. Life in the mountains was never easy, but John had learned to accept it as his world, the only one he truly knew. He had grown strong and self-reliant, shaped by winters that froze the land into icy stillness and summers that brought wildflowers and buzzing bees. His cabin, made of thick logs he had cut and carved himself, stood on a small clearing overlooking a valley. Smoke from the chimney curled lazily into the sky, a small sign of life in the vast wilderness. Inside, the walls were lined with the tools of a life lived simply but fully: axes, hammers, rope, and a few books he had gathered over the years. A worn rug covered the floor, and a sturdy wooden table sat in the center. Everything had a place and a purpose, and John took comfort in the order and control he had created. Each day began before the sun rose, and John would move through his morning chores with a quiet determination. He would feed the animals, chop firewood, and check the traps he had set for rabbits and deer. It was hard work, physically exhausting, but it filled his days and gave him a sense of accomplishment. The mountains demanded respect, and John had learned to give it. He knew which paths to follow, which rocks to avoid, and where the streams ran deep enough for fish. Every detail mattered, and he had no one to rely on but himself. Over the years, John had grown used to the solitude. He had friends in the nearby village, but the trips to town were rare. Most of the time, he preferred the company of the wind through the trees, the call of the owls at night, and the quiet crackle of the fire in his cabin. Conversation with other people had become almost unnecessary. He had learned to enjoy the silence, to find peace in it. Yet deep down, there was a small part of him that wondered what life might be like with someone else by his side, a companion to share the long winters with, to talk to during the quiet evenings, to laugh with under the stars. But John pushed those thoughts away. He told himself that love was for other people, that his life was too rugged, too demanding, for a relationship to thrive. Seasons came and went, each leaving its mark on John and his surroundings. Spring brought melting snow, muddy paths, and the first green shoots of plants breaking through the earth. John would spend hours planting vegetables in a small garden he had built near his cabin, hoping the soil would be kind and produce enough food to last the summer. Birds returned to the trees, and John would often watch them from his porch, admiring their freedom and grace. Summer followed with its long, hot days, perfect for tending the land, mending fences, and clearing trails through the forest. In those months, the mountains seemed alive with energy, and John felt at peace, though still alone. Autumn painted the valley in brilliant oranges, reds, and yellows. The leaves fell in thick carpets, and the air turned crisp and cool. John would gather firewood, prepare the cabin for the harsh winter, and store food in barrels and jars. He enjoyed the rhythm of these preparations, the sense that he was ready for whatever nature might throw at him. Yet, even in the beauty of the season, there was a quiet longing he could not shake, a faint, unspoken desire for someone to share the warmth of the fire with, someone to sit beside as the wind howled through the trees. Winter was the most challenging season. Snow would pile high against the cabin walls, and the mountains became a silent, white wilderness. The cold was sharp and biting, and the nights seemed endless. John would spend hours chopping wood, feeding the animals, and keeping the fire burning, all while the wind rattled the windows and snow drifts blocked the path to the outside world. It was in these moments, when the mountain was at its most unforgiving, that John felt the weight of his solitude. He would sit by the fire at night, staring at the flames, imagining what it might be like to have another presence there, a warm hand to hold, a voice to break the silence. But these thoughts were fleeting, quickly buried under the necessity of survival. John's life had become a cycle of labor and quiet reflection, a rhythm that left little room for change. Yet, he did not resent it. He had chosen this life, embraced it fully, and learned to find satisfaction in small victories: a successful hunt, a repaired roof, or a jar of pickles that would last through the winter. He took pride in his independence and self-sufficiency, and in many ways he was content. But contentment was not the same as fulfillment. There was a hollow part of him that even the beauty of the mountains could not fill, a subtle ache he had grown used to, though he would never admit it. Despite the hardships, John was a man of routine and discipline. Each task was approached with care, each decision weighed carefully. He knew the value of preparation and the cost of neglect. The mountains demanded vigilance, and John had learned to meet that demand without complaint. Friends in the village would sometimes comment on how hard he worked, how steady and dependable he was, and though he appreciated their praise, he rarely sought it. Recognition mattered little compared to the satisfaction of a day well lived, a fire well tended, a cabin secure against the winter storm. Occasionally, John would encounter travelers or hunters passing through the mountains. He was always polite, offering food, water, or directions, but these interactions were brief and distant. He did not seek companionship, not really, though he observed it in others with a quiet curiosity. Families traveling together, couples laughing by the stream, these sights stirred something inside him, a faint echo of a longing he refused to name. He would shake his head and return to his work, convincing himself that the mountains were enough. John also found solace in small routines that connected him to the wider world. He would sometimes read letters from distant relatives, books brought down from the village, or journals he kept of his own life. These written words were his companions when human voices were scarce. They reminded him of the world beyond the peaks, of lives lived differently, and of experiences he might never have. Yet, these reminders often brought a pang of longing, a subtle whisper that life could be fuller, richer, if shared with someone else. Still, for all his reflections, John had grown comfortable with the life he led. He was resilient, resourceful, and capable, and these traits had allowed him to thrive where many others might have struggled. He took pride in his ability to face the challenges of the wilderness alone. He had learned to rely on himself in every way, to meet his own needs, and to navigate the unpredictable terrain of mountain life with confidence. And while he recognized the quiet ache of loneliness, he had convinced himself that it was simply part of his path, a companion as constant as the mountains themselves. In his heart, John knew that his life was one of simplicity and discipline, but he also sensed that it might be missing something essential. He could not define it clearly, and he did not speak of it to anyone, but in quiet moments by the fire, he felt its presence. Perhaps, he thought, some things were meant to be discovered slowly, over time, and in ways that could not be predicted. And so, John continued his life in the mountains, strong, capable, and solitary, unaware that a change was approaching, one that would challenge everything he believed about love, companionship, and the possibility of happiness beyond his rugged routines. John Harper had always believed that his life would remain as it had always been, quiet, predictable, and solitary. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the mountains, the steady cycle of seasons, and the peace of isolation. But one cold morning, a letter arrived, carried by a horseman from the village several miles down the mountain. The envelope was plain, yet the words inside carried an unfamiliar weight. It was a suggestion from a distant relative, someone who remembered John's youth and his single life. The letter spoke gently of a young woman named Mary who had expressed interest in a practical match, a life together in the mountains. John read the letter carefully, setting it on the table before him. He had expected no surprises in his life, and this letter was a surprise. A visitor, a bride, someone to share his home and his days. The idea made him uneasy. He had never considered marriage beyond the stories he had heard in the village: joyful unions, family ties, laughter, and love. For himself, he had imagined only duty and obligation if such a path were ever necessary. John leaned back in his chair, staring at the wooden ceiling, the rough-hewn beams above. His mind wandered, imagining a stranger entering his world, a woman stepping into the harsh, untamed mountains he called home. At first, John tried to dismiss the idea. Surely, he thought, a woman would not be able to endure this life, the long winters, the isolation, the hard work. He had always prided himself on his strength and resilience, but he also recognized that the life he led demanded a rare kind of courage. He wondered what kind of person would willingly leave comfort and town life to live in a small, rugged cabin with a man she had never met. The thought made him uneasy, yet a tiny spark of curiosity flickered inside him, a feeling he could not name, though it felt strange and unfamiliar. Days passed as John considered the letter. He spoke to no one about it, keeping his thoughts private as he went about his daily chores. He chopped wood with more intensity than usual, fed the animals, and tended his garden, all while imagining the possibility of a visitor in his home. He wondered how he would even greet her, what words he would use, how the silence of his life might change with another presence. The mountains seemed quieter than ever, as if anticipating the arrival of someone who could transform the routine and the stillness into something entirely new. Finally, John made a decision. He would meet Mary, not out of excitement or hope, but out of a sense of responsibility. He could not reject the opportunity without understanding it fully. He set about preparing his cabin, doing small but meaningful tasks to make it more welcoming. He swept the floor, polished the wooden table, and stacked firewood neatly by the hearth. He even added small touches: a clean blanket on the bed, fresh water in the pitcher, and jars of preserved food carefully arranged on the shelves. Every action was deliberate, every detail a signal that he was ready for a guest, though his heart remained cautious and guarded. John spent the days before her arrival imagining every possible scenario. He pictured a quiet, timid woman who would stay mostly in the cabin, careful not to disturb his routines. He imagined polite conversation by the fire, perhaps a few shared meals, and little else. Love, he reminded himself, was unlikely. This was not about passion or romance. It was about companionship, about having another person to share the responsibilities of life. He braced himself for practicality, preparing for the life he had always expected: duty without warmth, partnership without emotion. The day Mary was to arrive dawned cold and crisp. John rose early, checking the paths around his cabin for snow or obstacles, making sure everything was in order. He gathered extra firewood, filled the kettle with water, and arranged the few chairs in the cabin so they would face the hearth. He wanted the first impression to be calm, welcoming, and steady, an extension of the life he had built here. Yet, beneath his careful preparation, there was an unexpected tension, a sense of anticipation that made his chest tighten and his hands feel slightly unsteady. When the horse's hooves finally echoed through the trees, John's heart beat faster than it had in years. He stepped outside, adjusting his worn coat and running a hand through his rough hair. A woman dismounted, her figure carrying a quiet confidence and poise that immediately caught his attention. She was Mary, the bride described in the letter, and now she was real, standing before him on the snow-dusted path. She smiled politely, and her eyes sparkled with a curiosity that seemed to reach beyond the mountains themselves. "Mr. Harper," she asked, her voice soft but firm, "I believe this is your home." "Yes," John replied, his voice deeper than usual, slightly awkward. I'm John Harper. Welcome." He stepped aside to let her pass, watching her carefully as she adjusted to the uneven path. She was cautious but unafraid, moving with a grace that suggested adaptability. John felt a strange mixture of relief and nervousness. She had come willingly, yet the uncertainty of what lay ahead pressed upon him. Inside the cabin, John showed her around, pointing out the practicalities of life in the mountains, where the firewood was stored, how to draw water from the stream, where food was kept. Mary listened attentively, asking questions politely, but also offering small observations about the beauty of the cabin and the surrounding land. Her presence was calm yet lively, and John found himself strangely intrigued by her thoughts and perspectives. She noticed the little details, the way he had carved shelves for his jars, the careful stacking of his tools, the small bouquet of wildflowers in a jar on the table. Each observation made John feel seen, in a way he had not realized he wanted. They shared their first meal together, a simple stew made with preserved vegetables and rabbit from John's traps. Mary helped serve the food, and as they ate, conversation began to flow more naturally than John had anticipated. She asked about his life in the mountains, his routines, and his experiences. He answered cautiously at first, keeping his words brief, but her warmth encouraged him to speak more freely. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of connection, a recognition that another person could understand the rhythms of his life and even find value in them. The evening came, and Mary lit a small lantern, filling the cabin with soft light. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls and giving the room a comforting glow. John watched her quietly, noting how she adapted to the simple life he had built, how she moved with respect and care, and how her laughter, though rare, was like music he had forgotten existed. He realized that his expectations of a lifeless, practical arrangement were being challenged. The warmth she brought was subtle but undeniable, and John felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years: hope. As the night deepened, they settled into their respective spaces, Mary in the small bed prepared for her, John in his worn blanket near the fire. The silence was no longer empty but shared, a gentle presence that made the cabin feel alive. John reflected on the day, thinking about how different it was from what he had imagined. He had expected politeness and distance, perhaps a life of mere duty, but instead he felt curiosity, warmth, and a strange anticipation for what might come. Before sleep claimed him, John realized something important. Life in the mountains, which had always been solitary and predictable, could be different. Perhaps it could be richer, fuller, even joyful, if shared with the right person. He did not yet know Mary fully, nor did he understand the depths of her heart, but he sensed that her arrival was the beginning of a change, a shift in a life he had believed would remain constant. And though he remained cautious, a quiet excitement began to grow in him, a subtle awareness that the mountain man's life, as he had known it, might never be the same again. When Mary Harper stepped fully into the cabin that first morning, John Harper felt an unfamiliar stir in his chest. She carried herself with a calm confidence, yet there was a gentleness in her eyes, a warmth that seemed to illuminate the small, wooden room. John had expected politeness, perhaps a quiet respect for the life he had built, but not the spark of curiosity and life that Mary carried with her. From the way she examined the shelves, the carefully stacked jars, and even the small bouquet of wildflowers he had placed on the table, John realized that she noticed things he had never expected anyone to notice. At first, their conversation was careful and deliberate. John explained the daily routines of mountain life, the small rules he followed, the work required to survive the winters, and the joys of the sparse but beautiful summers. Mary listened attentively, occasionally asking questions or making observations that were both practical and thoughtful. Her voice was calm, yet it carried a melody that made John pause in the middle of his explanations. He found himself listening not only to her words but also to the warmth behind them, the way she seemed genuinely interested in understanding his world. She asked about the animals, the traps he set, and the crops he planted. Her curiosity was not intrusive but gentle, and it encouraged John to share stories he had not told anyone in years. He spoke of the first deer he had trapped alone, the winter when the snow had piled so high he could barely open the door, and the nights he had spent staring at the stars, feeling both small and free in the vastness of the mountains. With every story, Mary listened with care, occasionally nodding or smiling, and John began to notice a change in himself. He was no longer merely recounting facts or routines. He was opening a part of himself he had long kept hidden. Mary's presence also brought a sense of life and movement to the cabin. She moved with grace, placing the few belongings she had brought neatly in the corner, arranging the small table for meals, and even helping with the chores John had expected to perform alone. She chopped some firewood, swept the floor, and helped feed the animals. At first, John watched her with a mixture of surprise and caution. He was used to doing these tasks alone, and sharing them with someone else felt strange. Yet as the day wore on, he realized that her presence made the work feel lighter, the hours pass more quickly, and the cabin warmer than it had in years. Outside, the mountains seemed transformed as well. When Mary followed him to the stream to fetch water, she marveled at the way sunlight danced on the water, how the snow glistened under the clear winter sky, and how the trees swayed gently in the wind. John had seen these things every day of his life, yet through Mary's eyes, they seemed new, almost magical. Her appreciation reminded him that beauty could be noticed and cherished even in the harshest places, and he felt a subtle joy he had not experienced in years. The mountains, which had always been a symbol of isolation, now seemed to welcome her presence. Meals became moments of connection rather than simple necessity. They ate together, sharing stories of childhood, family, and the paths that had led them to this moment. John spoke of his youth in the mountains, the lessons he had learned, and the solitude he had embraced. Mary shared tales of her own life, her hopes, and the dreams she carried for a simpler, quieter future. Though she had agreed to this union out of practicality, it was clear that her heart was open to the possibilities of life in the mountains. John listened, intrigued not only by her words but also by the way she made him feel, seen, valued, and surprisingly understood. In the evenings, the cabin felt different than it had ever felt before. The fire crackled brightly, casting a golden glow over the walls, and Mary would sit nearby, sometimes reading a book, sometimes simply watching the flames. Her presence brought a quiet companionship that John had not realized he craved. Silence was no longer empty, it was shared. He found comfort in it, and yet he noticed a warmth growing inside him, an unfamiliar curiosity about the life they might build together. He began to understand that this was not just a practical arrangement. It could be the beginning of something far more meaningful. Mary also had a gentle sense of humor that John found surprising. She noticed the little quirks in his routines, the way he arranged his tools, the meticulous stacking of firewood, even the way he hummed quietly while working. She would tease him lightly, making him laugh in a way he had forgotten he could. John had spent so many years in solitude that he had almost forgotten the joy of laughter shared with another person. With Mary, the cabin became a place of not just survival but happiness, a space where work and life could coexist with warmth and joy. As days turned into weeks, John observed more subtle changes in himself. He found that he no longer dreaded the long winter nights. Instead, he looked forward to them because Mary's presence made them bearable, even pleasant. He noticed himself sharing more of his thoughts, speaking freely without fear of judgment, and even seeking her opinion on matters he had always handled alone. He realized that he had underestimated the value of companionship, and that life shared could be richer than life endured alone. Mary, for her part, adapted quickly to the challenges of mountain life. She learned the rhythms of the land, how to handle the animals, and how to prepare meals from what the land offered. She was not perfect, nor did she pretend to be, but her determination and willingness to learn impressed John. He admired her courage and resilience, traits that mirrored his own but were tempered with gentleness and warmth. Together, they found a balance, a partnership that neither had expected but both began to cherish. Their bond grew through shared tasks and quiet moments alike. Mornings spent gathering water or chopping wood became opportunities for conversation and laughter. Afternoons tending the garden or repairing fences were filled with cooperation and mutual respect. Even the chores that had once felt lonely and tedious became moments of connection. John began to notice that the presence of another person could change not only the atmosphere, but also his own perspective. Work was no longer merely survival, but a shared effort that brought satisfaction and pride. John also discovered that Mary had a keen sense of observation, noticing details he had taken for granted. She would ask questions about the land, the animals, and the patterns of the seasons, showing an interest that went beyond the surface. Her insights, though sometimes simple, made him reflect on his own life in ways he had not considered. He began to appreciate the small joys he had long ignored, the beauty of a sunrise, the patterns of snow on the branches, the way sunlight warmed the cabin in the early morning. Through her eyes, the mountains seemed not just a place of work and survival, but a home filled with wonder and life. As the days passed, John realized that his expectations of a practical, loveless marriage were being challenged in every small way. Mary's presence had begun to awaken feelings he had long suppressed: curiosity, joy, and even affection. He found himself thinking of her when she was not there, wondering how she would respond to certain tasks or how she might view the landscape from a different angle. He caught himself smiling at the thought of sharing a simple meal with her or laughing quietly at a small joke. These were feelings he had thought were lost to him, yet they returned now, quietly, steadily, and unmistakably. One evening, as snow fell softly outside and the fire warmed the cabin, John realized something profound. The life he had built, strong, solitary, and disciplined, was not lacking because it was incomplete, but because it had never been shared. The mountains had taught him resilience and self-reliance, but Mary had brought a new lesson: that life, even in its harshest forms, could be brighter and more fulfilling when shared with someone who understood and cared. He felt a gratitude deeper than he had ever known, a recognition that her presence had transformed not only his surroundings, but his heart as well. By the time the first month had passed, John and Mary had settled into a rhythm together. Their partnership was not perfect. There were disagreements about chores, moments of frustration, and adjustments needed on both sides. But the bond they had formed was strong, built on mutual respect, understanding, and the quiet joy of companionship. John had expected a practical, duty-bound arrangement, yet he had discovered something far more profound. A shared life could be meaningful, even joyful, and that love might grow quietly, unexpectedly in the most unlikely places. And so John Harper, the mountain man who had once expected a loveless marriage, found himself opening to a new reality. Mary was no longer just a visitor in his cabin. She was a partner, a companion, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she was becoming the heart of his home. The mountains remained the same, rugged, beautiful, and demanding, but within their walls a transformation had begun. What John had thought would be an arrangement of duty had blossomed into something far more precious: connection, warmth, and the beginnings of love. Life in the mountains, which had once been a solitary routine for John Harper, now took on a new meaning. Mary had settled into the cabin fully, and each day together began to form a rhythm that was both comforting and challenging. The mountains were unforgiving, and John had long known that survival required careful attention, hard work, and patience. But now, with Mary by his side, every task carried a new significance. They were no longer simple chores. They were opportunities to grow together, to learn, and to support each other. The morning started earlier than most people in the nearby villages, as they always had, with John rising just before sunrise to ensure that the animals were fed and the fire was burning. Mary had quickly learned the routines, and together they worked efficiently, side by side. She would help water the plants in the garden, prepare breakfast, and tend to the animals. At first, John had been cautious about letting her take on these tasks, worried about the dangers of the cold streams or the sharp tools, but Mary's determination and carefulness quickly earned his trust. Her willingness to learn and her steady presence gave John a sense of partnership he had never known, and he began to see the mountains in a new light, not just as a place of survival, but as a place where life could flourish. The seasons continued to challenge them. Spring brought melting snow that flooded parts of the paths and made travel difficult. John showed Mary how to navigate the slippery trails, teaching her which rocks to step on and where the snowbanks were most treacherous. At first she struggled, slipping a few times, but John's steady guidance and her own determination helped her improve quickly. They laughed at the small mishaps, and even these moments strengthened their bond. The work was hard, but it was shared, and the burden of solitude that John had known for so long began to lift. Summer arrived with long, hot days. The garden needed constant attention, and John taught Mary how to tend the plants, how to water them properly, and how to recognize the signs of ripening vegetables. They worked together in the sunlight, their hands busy with soil and seeds, their conversation flowing easily. John began to notice how Mary's laughter lightened even the hardest work. Tasks that once felt monotonous became moments of shared joy. She brought new ideas to the work, suggesting ways to organize the garden or prepare food more efficiently. John realized that her presence was not only comforting but enriching. She added value to his life in ways he had never anticipated. Autumn was a season of preparation and reflection. Together, they harvested the crops, preserving vegetables and fruits for the harsh winter. They stacked firewood carefully, checked the roof for leaks, and prepared extra blankets. John had always taken pride in his careful planning and preparation, but with Mary helping, he found that the work was not only easier but also more meaningful. They shared stories as they worked, discussing hopes for the future, small dreams, and the life they wanted to build together. John noticed that he was speaking more openly than he ever had, sharing feelings and thoughts he had long kept to himself. Mary listened attentively, her presence gentle but affirming, and John began to understand that the life he had once thought complete on his own could be richer when shared. Winter brought its own trials. Snow piled high around the cabin, and icy winds whipped through the trees. They worked together to keep the fire burning and the cabin warm, bringing in wood from the stacked piles outside. Mary learned to handle the icy streams, the slippery rocks, and the chores that John had managed alone for so long. Even in the coldest moments, their partnership shone. They would sit close to the fire at night, sharing stories, reading letters from distant relatives, or simply enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's company. John realized that the harshness of the mountains was no longer a source of dread, but a stage on which their bond could grow stronger. Challenges were not limited to the weather. Sometimes animals would escape their pens or the traps would fail, leaving John and Mary to track them through the snow. There were moments of frustration and fear, especially when the nights were dark and the mountains silent. But together, they faced these challenges with patience and determination. Mary's courage impressed John. She was not afraid to step into situations that were unfamiliar or dangerous, and her calm, practical approach often helped solve problems faster than John had managed alone. He began to see her as not just a companion but an equal partner, someone whose presence made the difficult life they led more manageable and even rewarding. Their bond also grew through small gestures and moments of care. Mary would prepare hot meals after a long day of work, ensuring that John was nourished and warm. He, in turn, would repair her gloves, help her navigate the treacherous trails, and share stories that made her laugh. These small acts of kindness and attention strengthened their connection, building a sense of trust and intimacy that went far beyond the practical necessities of mountain life. John realized that love, though quiet and gradual, was forming between them, shaped by shared work, shared experiences, and the simple act of caring for one another. Mary's presence also brought emotional depth to John's life. He began to notice the beauty in moments he had previously overlooked, the way sunlight filtered through the trees, the songs of birds returning in the morning, and even the subtle patterns of snow across the landscape. Mary's perspective encouraged him to slow down and appreciate these details, reminding him that life, even in its hardships, had joys worth noticing. He felt a sense of gratitude he had never experienced before, not only for her companionship, but for the way she changed the way he saw the world. Together, they developed a routine that balanced work, leisure, and shared reflection. They would take long walks through the forest, discussing their dreams and the plans they hoped to realize. John would tell Mary about the history of the mountains, the paths he had traveled, and the lessons he had learned. Mary would offer her own insights, sometimes challenging him gently but always respectfully, encouraging him to consider new ways of approaching problems or appreciating beauty. Their conversations became a source of growth for both, deepening their understanding of each other and of the life they were building together. As the seasons continued, John began to recognize the transformation that had taken place within himself. He had once believed that he was meant to live alone, that love and companionship were luxuries beyond his reach. But Mary's presence had shown him that partnership could bring strength, joy, and fulfillment. He felt a sense of hope and possibility he had long thought impossible. Life in the mountains was still demanding and challenging, but it was no longer lonely. With Mary by his side, he felt capable of facing whatever hardships might come, knowing that they would face them together. The bond they shared also inspired John to be more attentive, thoughtful, and patient. He learned to listen carefully, to anticipate Mary's needs, and to communicate more openly. He discovered that compromise, understanding, and empathy were as important as physical strength and survival skills. Mary, too, adapted to his ways, learning to respect the routines and rhythms that had long governed his life. Together, they created a partnership built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and growing affection. One particular winter evening highlighted the depth of their bond. A fierce snowstorm had trapped them inside the cabin for several days, cutting off access to the outside world. Firewood dwindled, and food supplies became a concern. Yet, instead of panic or frustration, John and Mary worked together calmly. They rationed food carefully, took turns tending the fire, and shared stories to pass the long hours. Mary's courage and resilience shone brightly during this time, and John realized that their partnership had become a source of strength far greater than he had imagined. The storm, which might have been isolating and frightening alone, became a testament to their growing bond and trust. By the time spring returned, John and Mary had formed a deep, unshakable connection. They were no longer simply living together. They were building a life together, one filled with shared experiences, mutual support, and growing affection. John often reflected on how different his life had become from the lonely, solitary existence he had once known. He had expected a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience, yet he had discovered companionship, partnership, and love. The mountains, which had once symbolized isolation, now symbolized growth, resilience, and shared joy. John realized that Mary had transformed not only his daily routines, but also his heart. She had shown him that life could be shared in meaningful ways, that challenges could be faced together, and that joy could be found even in the simplest moments. Their love was quiet, steady, and enduring, built not on grand gestures, but on the daily acts of care, respect, and understanding that formed the foundation of their partnership. For John Harper, the mountain man who had once expected a loveless marriage, life had become richer, fuller, and far more rewarding than he could have imagined. By the time several years had passed, John Harper and Mary had created a life together that neither had imagined possible. The mountains, once symbols of solitude and hardship, had become the backdrop for a life rich in connection, shared experiences, and quiet love. John often reflected on how different his life had become. He had once believed that a marriage would be a duty, a practical arrangement without warmth or joy. Yet Mary had arrived and gradually, gently, reshaped his world, showing him that companionship could be more powerful than even the harshest winds or deepest snows of the mountains. The bond between them had grown steadily, rooted in trust, respect, and understanding. Every morning they would rise before the sun, tending to their small farm and their animals. They worked side by side, sharing not only the physical labor of mountain life, but also the emotional effort of maintaining a household, preparing food, and keeping the cabin warm through long winters. Each task was approached together, and each accomplishment was celebrated quietly, with smiles, laughter, and mutual recognition. John had once been proud of his independence, but now he realized that true strength came from partnership, the knowledge that someone else would stand with him through every challenge. Evenings were now moments of reflection and joy. After a long day of work, John and Mary would sit by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they shared dreams, sometimes stories from their past, and sometimes they simply enjoyed the comfortable silence that had once been so lonely. Mary would knit or read, while John repaired tools or whittled small pieces of wood. The cabin, which had once been a place of isolation, now felt warm and alive, filled with laughter, conversation, and the steady rhythm of life shared. John began to understand the subtle ways in which love transforms daily life, not through grand gestures but through consistent care, attention, and presence. Their life was not without challenges. Winters were long and harsh, and storms occasionally blocked the paths to the village. Food supplies sometimes ran low, and there were moments when the work seemed endless. Yet John and Mary faced every obstacle together. Where John had once relied solely on himself, he now depended on Mary, and she on him. This mutual reliance strengthened their connection, creating a sense of security and trust that neither had known in isolation. Mary's calm presence and practical solutions often balanced John's more cautious nature, and John's strength and resourcefulness reassured Mary in times of uncertainty. Together, they were a team, capable of weathering even the harshest storms. John also noticed the small ways in which Mary transformed his heart. He had once believed that emotions like love and joy were luxuries he could not afford, yet now he felt them deeply and fully. He found himself caring not only for her safety and well-being, but also for her happiness, noticing when she was tired, cold, or worried, and doing everything he could to support her. Likewise, Mary showed her care through countless little gestures, preparing meals he liked, arranging wildflowers in a jar, or simply sitting quietly beside him when the nights were long and dark. These small acts, repeated day after day, built a foundation of love that was strong, steady, and enduring. Their connection also deepened through shared moments of beauty and discovery. They would often walk through the forest together, observing the changing seasons, listening to birds, or marveling at the way sunlight filtered through the trees. John had seen these things for years, but through Mary's eyes, he noticed them anew. Her wonder and appreciation reminded him to pause, to value the small joys, and to see the world with fresh eyes. The mountains, which had once seemed lonely and harsh, now appeared full of life and possibility, a place where love could flourish alongside the challenges. Over time, John realized that his love for Mary went beyond gratitude or affection. It was a deep, abiding bond that touched every part of his life. He thought often of how he had expected a loveless marriage and how mistaken he had been. Mary had not only become his partner in practical matters, but also the center of his emotional world. She had taught him patience, compassion, and the joy of sharing life fully with another person. He found that even the simplest moments, a shared meal, a walk through the snow, a quiet evening by the fire, were filled with meaning and connection. Mary, too, had grown to understand the depth of their relationship. She admired John's strength, his resilience, and his careful attention to every detail of mountain life. She respected his routines and traditions while gently offering her own ideas and insights, creating a partnership that balanced both their strengths and weaknesses. Together, they had learned to navigate not only the physical challenges of the mountains, but also the emotional complexities of building a life together. They had faced adversity, celebrated successes, and discovered that love could thrive even in the harshest conditions. There were moments when they reflected on the life John had led before Mary's arrival. He had been content, yes, but the solitude had also left a quiet emptiness that Mary had filled. She had transformed his life in subtle ways, through laughter, companionship, shared work, and the simple act of being present. John realized that he could not imagine life without her. Her presence had become essential, like the fire that warmed the cabin or the sun that rose over the mountains. She had turned a lonely existence into one filled with love, trust, and fulfillment. As the years passed, their love grew deeper and more resilient. They faced new challenges, illness, storms, and the occasional misfortune of lost crops or wandering animals, but these trials only strengthened their bond. John found that he no longer feared difficulties as he once had. With Mary by his side, he felt capable of facing anything. He had learned that love was not a fleeting feeling but a steady commitment, a partnership built on trust, care, and shared experiences. Neighbors in the village often remarked on the remarkable partnership between John and Mary. They had heard of the mountain man who had once lived in solitude and expected a loveless marriage, and they were amazed at the life he had built with his bride. John rarely spoke of it, but he felt a quiet pride, not in the praise of others, but in the knowledge that he and Mary had created something rare and beautiful together. They had built a life that was grounded in reality but touched by love, a life that reflected both resilience and tenderness. The cabin itself seemed transformed. What had once been a simple shelter for survival was now a home filled with warmth, laughter, and memories. Mary's touch was everywhere, from the carefully arranged kitchen to the small decorations she added to make the space inviting. Even John noticed the subtle differences. The way the fire seemed brighter when she was nearby, the way the cabin smelled of fresh herbs and baked bread, the way the walls seemed to echo with laughter and conversation. The mountains remained rugged and untamed, but within their walls, life had become full, vibrant, and deeply meaningful. John often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought Mary into his life. He had expected a practical arrangement, a duty-bound marriage with little emotional attachment. Instead, he had discovered companionship, partnership, and a love that grew steadily, quietly, and powerfully. He realized that happiness was not about the absence of hardship, but about sharing life with someone who cared, someone who understood, and someone who transformed even the most difficult moments into shared experiences. In the quiet moments, John would watch Mary as she worked, read, or moved through the cabin, and he would feel a profound sense of gratitude. She had changed his life entirely, not through grand gestures or dramatic events, but through everyday presence, kindness, and love. He had expected duty, but he had received joy. He had expected routine, but he had received connection. He had expected solitude, but he had received a partner who had transformed not only his daily life but his heart itself. Their life together, built over seasons of work, shared challenges, and quiet reflection, had become a testament to the power of love and companionship. John Harper, the mountain man who had once thought himself destined for a loveless marriage, now knew that love could arrive unexpectedly, quietly, and completely. Mary had changed everything, not just the routines of his life, but the very way he saw the world, the mountains, and himself. As the sun set over the peaks one late evening, casting a golden glow over the cabin and the surrounding forest, John and Mary sat together by the fire. Their hands touched, their shoulders brushed, and in that simple contact was a lifetime of shared experiences, challenges overcome, and love built slowly but surely. John realized that life, even in its harshest forms, could be rich and full when shared with the right person. He had expected a loveless marriage, but what he had received was far more precious. A life filled with love, partnership, and the quiet joy of being fully known and accepted by someone he cared for deeply. The mountains, enduring and unchanging, had become witnesses to a transformation far more remarkable than the passing seasons. They had once been a world of solitude for John Harper, but with Mary, they had become a home, a sanctuary, and a place where love thrived. And in that realization, John understood something profound. Sometimes the greatest surprises in life come when we least expect them, and the most enduring joys arise from connections that we never imagined possible.